Widespread drought in the United States, corn dropping by 10 cents, and yet we are going to talk about the USDA's upcoming report right here on Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest rates in agriculture and livestock. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe. So, Jerry, how are you today? We had today corn going down by 10 cents in Chicago. I wonder why.
Oh, it's a combination of weekend uncertainties that always come this time of year with people on the sidelines ahead of reports. Also, the technicals on things here have been sluggish, to say the least. We've been trying to bounce above $5 in both September and in December here, and we haven't really been able to get that. So I think that's another feature in here, because we really, after we had people take the weekend off last Friday and the report, many of them didn't really even come back here, and it's made it kind of a choppy market in both corn and soybeans here, as the weather situation around the Midwest. We've had some opportunities for some good rains, but there's been a lot of places that missed rains too. You just pointed out the drought is still a viable situation. And so that means everybody's eyes are on the sky trying to figure out what's going to happen with the weather going forward.
Yes, and what's going on at the heart of the Corn Belt in states like Iowa and Illinois? Maybe let's talk about Nebraska.
Well, it's been kind of a mixed bag between those three, relatively speaking. I'd have to say Nebraska, to some extent, the eastern third of the state, which is from Omaha to Lincoln and from by Sioux City down south, that's the third of the state that's dry land. And so that's the drought out there. They registered on this week's drought monitor was still there in a vengeance. There has been some rain around, but it hasn't been the dynamic rain that's hit in parts of Illinois here. We had a very good rain event that came through on the weekend. That gave southern Iowa and on into central Illinois some very good rains. And that while parts of north central and northwest Iowa is still looking for a drink. From there, Chicago's had a couple of big bursts here. We had some, but the problem is there's not much corn in Cicero, Illinois, southwest of Chicago, that got 11 inches. So unfortunately, that kind of news though does end up impacting the commodity markets because, well, it's Illinois, from there. So that's some of the features we're dealing with. There definitely was some rains that moved into some parts of Indiana, but I'd have to say Ohio didn't really receive as much rain as they'd like to have seen out of this whole event. So we've got some showers around tonight, spotty stuff. Got same situation midweek next week. The twist of it is here on weather is that the Midwest and east of the Mississippi here, the temperatures are not going to be 90 to 100 degrees. Now, want to go to Texas, you want to go to Southwest Kansas, those places, yes, you can find plenty of heat. And I think that's another twist here is I think the East Coast investors kind of look at the Chicago weather pattern as the definitive one. And that sometimes isn't the case out there as we go forward here. But right now, I think everybody's trying to kind of sit back and figure out what's the impact of all these acreage changes that the USDA announced last week.
Now, an interesting fact about the drought is an ongoing situation in the United States. And the one who everybody knows is benefiting from that is Brazil. I learned about some numbers about egg exports in Brazil. And the volume of egg exports coming out of Brazil in the first 5 months of the year has surpassed all last year combined, mostly going to the United States and Japan.
Well, no, definitely Japan is part of it, and China has been part of those exports. Yes, we've had a pretty substantial jump in the soybean output in Brazil. We all have heard right now it seems to be somewhere between 153 and 157. I don't know. That's another thing the USDA is going to update us with on Wednesday of next week. Corn has been an interesting one. From there, there has been some U.S. shipments, by the way, of soybeans that have come to the Southeast. This month particularly was kind of interesting. Someone mentioned this to me today, and we've been doing less than 1 million, maybe 1.5 million on imports on soybeans. We were up at nearly 4.7 million on the update this week. But we also had a very impressive set of numbers here on soybeans. Right at this point, with just 9 weeks to go, we only need, excuse me, about 70 million in sales to reach the USDA. Now that doesn't mean that that the sales are going to be out the door, which is what exports are all about. But on soybeans, the exports that have been shaggy here recently are not as bad off as you think. Now, corn is a whole different story. The world is thinking, and rightly so here, the basis levels for Brazilian corn, because they've got a lot of big crop down there on beans already. Their storage is full. You really don't put beans on the ground. You might do that with corn from the standpoint that and so there's been some really the world's sitting back to see if they can get some cheaper values on corn from Brazil. And right now, at least, that's part of the reason why this market, after it fell back in here, hasn't been able to really recover much over the last 4 or 5 days.
Now, from your own numbers, your own estimates, you are reducing by a little bit the corn exports in the U.S., and I guess the reason is the more competitive corn in Brazil.
Yes, yeah, that's part of it. From there, the old crop scenarios here, we've really kind of been shifting those down all along here ever since back in the wintertime. China's been standing and waiting for Brazilian corn. They bought you Brazilian corn. That type of thing. The world at this point has really been focused on the cash prices coming out of there. And also the only twist of this thing is that China also is utilizing some of the last of their purchases they had before this whole Black Sea situation and the corridor was shut down, and then it opened, things like that. Now it sure looks like that the Russians are not in any mood to come up with any real reason why they need to expend it after mid-July. So that could be a factor in here to pick up a little bit of U.S. corn in here. But right now, the possibility of it slipping some, the old crop scenario going forward is there. The opposite side of the thing is that the twist of it is that the statistics we heard from the USDA on the June 1 corn stocks showed an unusual situation popped up in there where feed demand is not something that you can measure easily as you go through the season, because I would say these days probably 25-30% of the U.S. corn that is fed to livestock is actually off of on-farm storage. From there, it used to be a heck of a lot higher than that, but over time we've really specialized our livestock producers, and so they're out there buying things from either their neighbors or from the elevator or from a merchandiser in the Southwest or in some parts of the country, like the chickens and that, where they have to ship in this stuff from the Midwest. And so the only way we can figure out how much corn's used is the fact that we look at the beginning stocks. We take the exports that we can measure, and that, by the way, this week came in a little higher than expected, but still not very impressive at this point. And of course, then we have our ethanol and industrial demand numbers that we can monitor. But the big hole out there is feed demand, and feed demand right now during the month, or the spring quarter, I should say, this year, the spring quarter residual / feed demand was 1 billion bushels, and that was up from 850 million last year. Well, that's good. We got more demand. Problem is, we don't have enough livestock numbers out there to really point to say that that 1 billion number kind of makes sense in our heads. We got steady to maybe slightly higher poultry and pork. The big thing is that we've been running anywhere from 2 to 3% or 2.5% average lower on the number of cattle in U.S. feed yards, and that's part of the reason why we had a very, very strong beef market up until early to mid June, and that with the reports we've had. Biggest problem is that without those cattle numbers, that 150 million more feed demand doesn't really ring true. It doesn't. How does this happen? Well, it really suggests, and I think that's the reason why we've seen some of these stocks numbers and also production numbers here on this report from the trade, being very cautious at the fact that we might see some adjustment in last year's corn size. We had a 13.7 number, and it kind of looks like we could be 150 or more million overestimated in the crop size, which would then take the 173 bushel yield down closer to 170. And so that's the real twist here that's coming to the corn market, because the average trade guess here is just virtually the same as it was coming into here for next year, about 2.25 billion bushels. And you'd think, wow, with the 5 million increase in or 5.5 million acres, that we would turn around and have a potential increase in carryover stock, which we didn't have because the yields out there are very shaky too. Lots of reports about short corn across the Midwest as a lot of these traders are driving around during the 4th of July weekend.
Now, in terms of surface, you are reducing the soybean surface for July.
Yes, well, that comes from the scenario here of the USDA reporting a 4 million decline in plantings, and we had, as I said, 2.1 million increase in corn plantings, which we also had a bounce of spring wheat plantings and cotton hanging in there, so it kind of all balanced out. But from the standpoint of the numbers here, the 4 million decline, when you have kind of a 51 bushel estimate, which is kind of 1 bushel down from the trade, and that's basically because of the kind of weather we've had in both corn and soybeans here over basically late May up to just before the 4th of July holiday, and that we've the U.S. trade estimates are I think it's 51.4, and on corn it's 176.6, which is down from 181. So we've already discussed my attitude about the USDA's 181.5 bushel yield. So it looks like we're going to see if the USDA kind of comes back towards the trade expectations here on next Wednesday's number. But on the soybeans, particularly because of the combination of a slightly lower stocks level and that. Now, the one thing about this is that exports have been a little shaky. I don't think they're as bad off as some people think, but anticipating maybe a slight decline in some exports there, or excuse me, demand, and that we're leaving our carryover stock at 232 or 30. Yeah, I think that's the average trade guess, and that actually happens to be my estimate. But on the soybean side, that reduction in production really starts cranking down the USDA's 350 million carryover stock, with the trade at 199 million. I'm out further down at 159 million carryover stock being released, and that's part of the reason why beans shot up dramatically on Friday and Monday of this week, and I think it's still got to be a feature. Now, the one thing, and it's popped up, and I have to agree, there will be an increase in double crop soybeans from Missouri through Illinois, Indiana, maybe a little in Ohio, and that, but areas north, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, it's a very dangerous situation for them to increase their double crop. In essence, what that means is you plant beans after wheat, and the wheat harvest is, in some cases here in those states, except for Illinois, maybe, really not that far along. So that's the other feature in here. But there's talk of 1 million acres of double crops, which would compensate for some of this lost production because of first crop beans. But right now, at least, we'll have to see how interesting the USDA wants to make some adjustments on that. They've got right now got to figure out what to do with the 4 million that they don't have and adding more back in. There's some talk that we might actually even have a survey on double crop beans before the end of the season, but I haven't seen anything official from the USDA on that yet.
Yes, and what other than the report you're watching next week?
Well, of course, we got to keep an eye on that U.S. weather and how much it comes down and where it comes at. At this point, I'd have to say that eastern Indiana and Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan needs to be watched closely, along with Minnesota and the Dakotas, and also probably just the northern sections here. Right now, the weather patterns are still not all that positive about good rains for both corn and soybeans at this point. It's probably a lot more important about what was going to happen on corn short term. I've heard people say that this rains that we had, and there were some substantial ones out there that came in a nice, timely fashion, but the stress of in the corn crop at this point, ahead of this weekend rains and then the pollination next week, can be interesting. It can ears are not just determined on the day that the pollination occurs from the tassel to the ear itself and the silk. There's things that get set before that, and it'll be quite interesting. The one twist that I've heard from many people is that when they drive down the road, they're not looking at a taller crop. Now, that doesn't mean that the crop can't be a solid one out there and good, but it might have taken something off the top of it here. So that really kind of reflects back in that 181.5 back to 176. And I guess that puts us in a kind of an interesting area. That it doesn't really tighten us up dramatically, but at the same time, it takes away all the excess talk that, our carryover crop is going to be huge and we're going to be 2.5, 2.7 on carryover stock for next year. I think that part of the equation has been reduced. And at this point, if we do start to tighten it down further and we take that 2 billion number that's floating around out here on Corvero stock for next year gets down to 1819, that's going to make people a lot more nervous about what's going on around the world, because hey, Brazil had a good year this year, doesn't guarantee they're going to have a good one next year. I know Argentina's hoping like hell they'll bounce back after their disastrous year, and what happens with Ukraine. Right now, one last thing we don't want to forget about, lots of comments coming out of China that heat over there has put a little damper on some of their corn prospects. So that's another one that right now corn is growing a lot of different places. So we just don't want to think that the U.S. and Brazil are the only two places that are important to the corn market.
All right. Thank you very much.
You bet. Have a good weekend, and we'll see what the next week weather wants to do for the U.S. prices. But I kind of feel we're down at support level in this corn, and the soybeans, I think, is still going to be quite interesting to see if this USDA does tighten this thing down to 200 or less carryover stock for next year. That could spike this beans up a little more exciting next week.